who are with us today and from wherever you are connecting. I see Maryland and Pennsylvania and also the state of Washington. Of course, we have our good friend Nigel with us from Newark, England. Today we're here to participate in the webinar Youth Work After Christendom Revisited. Mission and work with young people has undergone significant transformation since the 2008 publication of Youth Work After Christendom. And since then, there has been an emergence of post-Christendom narrative as pioneers and prophets have begun to dance to a new missional tune. However, for many people in our churches, as we know, they're still about getting young people in church on Sunday. The Christendom mindset is alive and well and continues to unhelpfully inform far too much of Christian-motivated ministry with youth and young adults. This webinar will reflect back on the original book and consider models of mission with young people based upon symbiosis, social justice, and exploration of new uncharted waters. But I'd like to introduce to you our presenter, Dr. Nigel Pimlott. He is passionate about the work with young people. He has worked for Frontier Youth Trust for 15 years and offers a wealth of experience and insight about faith, mission, and the world we live in, including his...
Good to be with you. Thank you for that welcome. You're very welcome to connect with me on Facebook. That would be a pleasure. Well, it's good to be here. This is the first time I've done a webinar, so I'm excited and nervous at the same time, so I'm so glad people can join us. I think we have an all-American audience, so it's nearly my bedtime, but I guess for you it's kind of early in the day or perhaps a different time zone to the one I'm in. So if we can bear with each other, that would be wonderful. Just to help us connect a little bit, just to say a little bit more about myself, I've been working with young people in a whole host of settings really now for around about 30 years. My current role, I'm the Deputy Chief Exec of Frontier Youth Trust. Our strapline, sort of tagline is mission with young people at risk. So we work with young people who might be considered on the edge of society, on the edge of church, perhaps don't fit in or have challenges which need some support to help them in their life. So we do a whole host of things from supporting workers, running specific projects, working with young offenders, run a big network called Street Space, which I might refer to later, which is basically trying to connect similar types of work up and down the UK who are working on a detached youth work basis in skate parks, town centres and the like. And we have about 50 projects aligned to that, so that's kind of exciting. An innovative approach, which very much reflects a post-Christendom narrative, if I can use that language. Just to say what my values are, just so perhaps you know where I'm coming from, and hopefully we can reflect these as we go. I'm very much into participation, so please do ask any question you wish. Just type it in the box. If I don't know the answer, I'll ask Stan to help us. I also like to be creative and to perhaps challenge the status quo. I probably need to warn you, I'm aware from my trips to the US, I have a cousin in Michigan, that sometimes my sense of humour is misinterpreted, shall we say. So do bear with that too. I wouldn't want to cause any disempowerment or alienate anyone by that. Hopefully we'll be able to raise our awareness levels this evening as we kind of go on this journey together. My kind of plan is to set the scene as to where this work has come from, to suggest a brief overview of where we might be going and what might be emerging in sort of contemporary culture post-Christendom, and to look at those specific approaches which Stan mentioned at the beginning. What I'm not going to do, which I hope is okay, is to flood our time with Bible references, not because I don't believe that's important, but I think that's something we could perhaps do at a later date, just so we get the most out of our conversation. I'm also going to resist, and I am going to resist, being critical of any individuals or denominations or particular contexts, and try and avoid sort of making it very focused against anyone particular. The last slide of my PowerPoint has my email address, and you're very welcome to connect with me if you want any more information or ongoing dialogue. That would be great. So, for those who might not be familiar with the term post-Christendom, just a brief sort of introduction to the topic. I'm drawing very much on Stuart Murray's original work, his book, which I will hold up so you have a look at it. Post-Christendom, where are we? There we go. Is well thumbed, as you can see from my version. Stuart said, post-Christendom is the culture that emerges as the Christian faith loses coherence within the society that's been definitively shaped by the Christian story. As the institutions that have been developed to express Christian convictions decline in influence. So that's my starting point as to what I think post-Christendom is about. I think immediately you name an entire area of a country, a state, perhaps in your context, or a nation, or even a whole Western civilization, as a particular culture that becomes very problematic at the moment. I often get asked by youth workers and ministers, what should I do or what should we do? And I'm very nervous about answering that question, because I think every culture at the moment seems to be becoming more and more distinct geographically and ethnically, and I think that adds some particular challenges to how we go about working with young people. I think what we can say with certainty is the UK and the United States particularly, we have a fading cultural memory of Christendom and the Christian story. We've seen young people, particularly in this country, and I know it's happening over there too, begin to leave church as they grow older. And the latest research over here from David Boas and his associates is beginning to point towards a narrative which says those young people aren't even going to church in the first place, let alone leaving it when they get older. So we have this kind of background. Some young people are declaring themselves or have been labelled as the nones. They have no religious affiliation. Others have what I would call a pick and mix mentality, perhaps, where they like a little bit of the Christian narrative, they might like a little bit of Buddhism, they like a lot perhaps of consumerism or a little bit of capitalism, lots of isms, and that's a very fluid kind of existence, and what is believed and practiced, if we can call it a practice today, might not be done tomorrow. It's very kind of flexible. We've also got a growing number of people, and I used to be in this, called the Duns, who have been to church, have dropped out of church, but certainly haven't dropped out of following God and pursuing a lifestyle as a disciple of Jesus. They just can't cope with the institution of church and what we would call in front of Youth Trust the gravitational pull towards that institutionalism. So they're trying to develop what they would see as a more authentic expression of their faith. Often that's done in small communities, or perhaps even in isolation, which is another challenge in itself. But I have to say it's not all post-Christendom, if I can use that sort of narrative again. I can take you to many places in this country, as I'm sure you can in the States, where Christendom is really alive and well. We have the very big churches who are attracting large numbers. Our summer Christian festivals, Soul Survivor being the most famous one, continues to be very popular, with tens of thousands of young people gravitating to what I would say is very much a Christendom model of being. Equally, in this country, and I know it's the same perhaps in other countries too, we have areas of the country which perhaps have never been Christendom, certainly in the last few decades. Typically in this country, some of our cities are dominated by people from a Pakistani, Indian and Bangladeshi ethnic background. They might be third or fourth generation ethnic background now, but they have never practiced Christianity or perhaps even aware of Christendom. They're more likely to be Muslim, Sikh, Hindu, and so forth. And so, again, another set of challenges emerges as we kind of do that. The response over here has been to develop a whole raft of initiatives to try and engage or re-engage young people. I've made a notice of them. We have pioneer churches, emerging churches, fresh expressions, messy church, missional communities, Catholic Church, and a dozen other names, all trying to broaden the appeal of church and engage people in different ways. So that's just kind of where I would be positioning where we're coming from. So if anyone wants to come back on the app, do type in a question and we can visit that as we go. Having said all that and framed it very much around the language of church, I think my opening comment would be that church is not a particularly helpful framework for me. My missional quest within post-Christendom is all about pursuit of the kingdom, developing shalom, and being a disciple of Jesus. I find that the language of church, and we call it bums on seats over here. I think Stan was being polite, but that's the language we've got. The idea of young people being bums on seats on a Sunday is still a very strong driver in many faith communities, and I don't find that a particularly effective measure of whether a young people's developing their faith or spirituality, and I don't think it's a particularly good indicator as to how we're seeking and building the kingdom. So I kind of just offer that as an introductory ramble to set the scene and to set us off on our journey. So as I say, if you've got any questions, do type them in. Those of you who might have seen Stuart's book, he talks about transitions, and I put them up here in very simple language. He talks about a transition in post-Christendom from where Christendom was at the centre and Christians were to now we're at the margins, and we were a majority and now a minority. We were perhaps settlers and now we're sojourners or journey people. We did have privilege, and now we live in plurality. We could exercise control, and that's still prevalent in this country with our church-state connections, which I know is different over in the States. But now our influence is only really gained by our effective witness. We've moved from maintenance to mission and institution to movement. I think within each of those transitions, there's an opportunity for me. I think growth takes place in the margins, and I find that a very exciting possibility. I think there's a sense that when we're in a minority, we can really live counterculturally and perhaps stand out as being different to everyone else. I think one of the big transitions which has happened over here is I think there is very much now an acceptance that faith is a journey and it's a development process, and the journey is more important or as important as the destination. I think that's really changed in the last decade over here. As I've mentioned, we live in a very plural society, but again, I see opportunities within that we can be representatives and ambassadors for Jesus in a way with young people who've never ever encountered anything to do with Christianity, and I find that very exciting. And in the same way, our witness in our communities and neighbourhoods helps us to do that. Again, I think we have moved from maintenance to mission. I'm not saying maintenance has stopped in this country, but we're very much, we're realigning our church. I would say it's a work in progress as we become much more missional in our engagement with young people and how we do that whole kind of agenda, really. And the idea of moving from an institution to a movement, a people of God, I think is a work in progress, and both are still quite prevalent, but I think we are beginning to see an emerging movement, particularly things like I talked about earlier, the Street Space Network. And we reckon we reach about 8,000 young people a month in the 50 project, and that's very much a movement which would kind of typify the type of change which I think has happened. I did this session with the church, and the old people, or older people, I would say, without being too prejudicial, they sometimes struggled with this analysis, and they weren't all that comfortable with it. And we had a frank exchange of views and a little bit of a debate. And then there was a young guy, 15-year-old, I'll never forget him. He stuck his hand up and he said, "Didn't Jesus only do the things on the right-hand side of that list?" And I paused and I went, "Indeed he did." And that seemed to just stop the argument in its tracks. And all of a sudden, other people began to see with fresh eyes that perhaps there was something in this which was very Jesus-centered. And so, again, I just offer that as an introduction. I wanted to just mention the terms I'm going to use this evening. I don't know how it sits with the American church culture in too much detail. When we did the original book, Youth Work After Christendom, we lumped youth work and youth ministry together. I think for this evening's purpose, I'd like just to separate those out a little bit. For me, youth work is about seeking to engage young people who perhaps have no experience of faith, and we might do that in a youth club, a centre, a drop-in, or a detached kind of basis. Whereas youth ministry for me is more about how we might do prayer, Bible study, worship with young people and outreach and so forth. I know they're not universally accepted terms, but those are the ones I'm just going to use this evening just to help us on our way, if that's okay. The original book came out in 2008. In the UK, it's just about sold out, I think. There are a few second-hand copies, and we still have some copies in front of Youth Trust, but the publisher about a month ago only had 5 or 6 left. So that's been an encouragement and an exciting kind of time. I think there's a sense that we've made some progress. The original book talked about more participation, empowerment and inclusive approaches for young people within what we might do as youth workers and ministers, and I think certainly over here we have made some progress on that. As I mentioned, I think faith has become a journey, not a destination. Again, I know it's a culturally specific reference, but one of our leading banks, Lloyds Bank, has for the last probably 5 or 6 years now had as its advertising slogan for the journey, and that's been a real nice cultural connection with spiritual and faith development, that it is really for the journey. One of the things we talked about in the book originally was the need to experiment, and again I think we have really begun to do that, find new ways of engaging, working with young people and equipping young people, and I think also within that is a sense of a renewed focus on community. I think that there's still a very strong indication that faith is perhaps focused on individuals. It's an individual commitment, an individual perhaps salvation, an individual journey. But I think there's a growing sense that actually perhaps this is a community thing too. It's a communal understanding of being in this together and journeying with God as community. And finally, one of the things which I think has been very positive, there's been a very clear focus on what we would call the Missio Dei, which I hope is a term you're familiar with. The idea that God himself or herself is on mission, and that really what we should be doing is joining in with that, rather than Nigel having a good idea and seeing if it works. So I think that's become a very strong principle by which many people are now working. We're looking for what God is doing and then seeking to join in with it. I think there's some things that perhaps we haven't done, which I would have hoped we'd done from the book. There's still very much an emphasis on hierarchical models of leadership, and in this country on ordained ministry as the way. The church I go to, which is in a very rural setting, is delighted that it's now got a vicar, a minister. It's not had one for many years, but I'm not sure that that's the solution to our problems, to have ordained ministers in that way. Again, the kind of, forgive me if you're not familiar with the language, but the neoliberal kind of ideal of focusing on outcomes in our work, particularly our youth work in this country, very much threatens a process and development approach to youth work. It's very prescriptive, and it does things to young people rather than journeys with them. I still think we're too conservative. I don't think we come anywhere near reflecting the radical personhood of Jesus. We kind of like the status quo, and that's okay. And I think we can be much more radical and intrusive, if you like, into how we go about our work with young people. And as I mentioned already, that gravitational pull, which seeks to almost drag people towards the institution, I think is also a real kind of obstacle which still pervades. And if you do come on Facebook, you will often find many debates about how that manifests itself and so forth. I think the good thing for those of us who work with young people is I don't think we should be threatened by these transitions to post-Christendom. I think Youth culture is always transitioning. It's very fluid, it's fast moving, it's responsive, um, it likes engaging with people who care for young people. It likes to explore the new and value relationship. And so I find it a very comfortable place to be in, a very relaxed place to be in, that as culture changes, so does our ministry and work. So I don't think we need to fear those transitions. I think I would encourage us to embrace them and to see where we go, but perhaps more of that later. So I'm going to press us on to looking at one of the specifics I would like to suggest might be an indicator for the future. It's called symbiosis. I don't know if it's a term you're familiar with, but technically symbiosis is what's called a long-term beneficial interaction between two or more individuals or organisations or things. And I think one of the ways of embracing a post-Christendom culture and developing a post-Christendom missional approach is to work symbiotically. And the best way I can illustrate that is by this picture here. I don't know if you've seen it before, but there's a symbiotic relationship, as it's called, between the crocodile and the plover bird. So this is what nature has done the deal on. The crocodile needs to keep those teeth real sharp and real clean in order to be an efficient killing machine. If it loses its teeth, the short and end of it is it will die. So it needs to have good teeth. So what it does is it allows the plover bird to sit in its mouth and clean its teeth. The plover bird is allowed to take the scraps of meat which you've gathered, and the plover bird has worked out, and I don't know how it worked it out, but it's worked out that the crocodile isn't going to shut its mouth on the plover bird. It might shut its mouth on other things, but not the plover bird. So the plover bird gets a free meal, and the croc gets free dental treatment. And that's how it works. And I think that's a model for how we might approach post-Christendom missional work with young people, that we become codependent upon each other, we develop a sense of mutuality, which is not the worker doing things to young people in a way which assumes they have power, but it's very much what I would call a learner-learner approach. And I think this is an approach Jesus often adopted, that he put himself in the debt of others. The woman at the well would be the classic. And they worked together in order to develop something better. I don't want to go too academic, but my PhD study, which I finished in 2013, this was a very strong finding that the projects I researched worked in this mutually beneficial symbiotic way. And I think it's a very powerful way of approaching things. Part of it for me is if we can stop seeing young people as problems to be solved, as people in what we would technically call deficit, and begin to embrace them as co-authors of a missional journey, I think that would completely re-orchestrate how we might do things. I think when we look at the New Testament and we look at the stories of the disciples and the apostles, it's a done deal. We can read all the story and we know what happens, and it was a given. But I think if you were in that story, I don't think that those young guys, and I think they would have been young, knew where it was going. And they kind of made it up in an open-ended way and journeyed with it. And I think there's something we can learn from that. I think if I could contrast the symbiotic approach, this is not the fox and the chicken or the wolf and the lamb, where one lives off the other and devours the other in the process of that existence. And there's only one winner usually in those relationships, whereas in the symbiotic approach, there's everyone's a winner. It's co-beneficial, if you like. So it's a model I'm offering just as a way forward, that we work, as I say, with young people. We find out where they're at and what they want, and we come almost with open arms, open ears, and open eyes to the possibility of faith being expressed differently as we pursue Jesus together. And so that's one kind of model which I would just want to put out there. If you have other models, I mean, what other models work for you? Do type the question. That would be most helpful. I will pause. Is Is Stan available? Any questions, Stan?
Well, hey Nigel, I'm available, and it brings to mind. Well, one question as you were sharing about the post-Christendom model and some of the changes that are taking place. It seems like that we're caught in this tension of moving between from a product-oriented form of youth ministry or youth work to process form of youth work.
Yeah.
And that requires a lot of patience, I would guess.
Yeah.
And so, what is it, how is it that we work into this in a way that we can be symbiotic? Because it seems like one of the outcomes of being able to move, to go from product to process, is that we become more symbiotic.
Yeah. I mean, I would say this is probably one of the biggest challenges, certainly that we face in Frontier Youth Trust, especially when we begin to encounter what we might say was more secular types of youth work, which is very product dominated. I think we're not of one mind of it in Frontier Youth Trust. I'm very process orientated, whereas some of my colleagues use the phrase professional but pragmatic. And they recognize that the ideal dream might be the process-driven approach, but actually there is a demand that still necessitates that product. I think it needs careful negotiation. But if I go back to what I said earlier, I think the solution of it for me is the Missio Dei. If we can exercise discernment and grace and have courage to go with that leading of where God is taking us, I think that will provide a space and a place within which we can do that process. I fully recognize people in perhaps more Christendom-orientated churches, if we go back to that, don't always have that privilege. In England at the moment, I think there's the opportunity to run both models. We've still got the buildings, we've still got money short, we still have some money, we still have volunteers, we still have youth workers, and so there is at the moment space to do the more traditional, perhaps Christendom type orientated things, but also experiment with the process orientated approach and to take a few chances and to pursue those dreams, exercise that courage. I mean, I put this banner up partly to a bit of advertising, but in Frontier Youth Trust, we do try to support those with the dreams. It is what we want to do. So I think dreaming is a really important part of this process. That we do dream those dreams and pursue and stay with the process and develop the symbiotic, and be prepared for it to not quite always work how we think it's going to work. I think that permission giving to fail or for it not to quite work out how we think, that's, I think, fine, and I would want to reclaim that opportunity to do that in a specific way, the permission giving way.
It seems like also that we've moved, that what I'm hearing you say is that it raises a question that we've moved to where the church and does not necessarily have all the answers. That if we're going to be in this symbiotic relationship, that we're going to have to be humble and vulnerable and be open to what culture has to teach us and to show to us if we're going to see God at work. That's
so
a
I think
difficult challenge for us since we've always had a fixed mentality. Could you respond to that or say more about that?
Yeah, I mean, in Frontier Youth Trust, one of the things we do is we will sometimes tell the parables of Jesus or versions of them cold, and we will resist interpreting them, and we will ask young people from post-Christendom culture what they think the parables are saying. And I would say it's very rare that they interpret them in what we might call an orthodoxy way. They'll always have a fresh take, a fresh understanding, and I get very excited by that, because we're almost recreating the times when Jesus did it, that people would be going, what on earth does that mean? What sense do we make of that? And so, yes, it is very risky and challenging, I think, about how that works. But I think, and again, it's my passion that unless we go there, I don't think we will ever know. And I get very frustrated, if I'm honest, that people perpetuate things which clearly don't work, or at best a holding ground, whereas I would really like, as I say, within this window of having the opportunity to let's have a go and see if something else will work. And I believe it does work. It just doesn't always look like we might think it looks. And again, we have challenges over here. If we have 20 older people on a Sunday, it's church. If we have 50 young people gathering on a skate park, having communion with Coke and chips, that's not church. And I think we need to do some work about more quickly naming the communities which emerge as church, and hopefully resourcing them as appropriate, really. So that in a nutshell answer, that would be two of the things I would really hope to do.
Well, I'm going to step off. One is that there's been an appreciation for the symbol that you've used with the bird and the alligator, and so I'm going to step off so you can resume your presentation. Thank you, Nigel.
Thank you. Okay, I think symbiosis would be my first appeal. I think my second appeal would be to focus what we do perhaps in what I would call more of a social justice orientated way. I know it's the same across much of the Western world, in that young people have disengaged from perhaps macro-political, as I would call them, issues and are fed up with partisan politics, but they're really interested in specific issues, in justice and in fair play and equality and all those kind of dynamics. And I think this is one way of really engaging and empowering young people to engage with whatever post-Christendom might look like. We go to the Greenbelt Arts Festival at Frontier Youth Trust, and we ran a cafe this year from 10 o'clock at night to 3 o'clock in the morning, and lots of young people went, and we invited them how would they like to change the world, and the young people were never ever short of things they wanted to change, things they wanted to do, actions they wanted to take around the environment, around equality, around giving people a chance in life. And so I think there's something resonating with contemporary culture which connects, perhaps in my language, the ideals of shalom and a just God with some of the challenges we face in the world. And partly my work about politics comes in here. The picture, the right on the screen, I went to a protest in London a few weeks ago, where we were part of the Occupy movement, and the police behaved, in my view, very shockingly. But a whole group of young people were really engaged around this whole issue of wanting to reclaim democracy and to make something more positive about it. I think part of that for me is to make sure that we don't do this for or to young people. I think my passion about making this work in post-Christendom context is to train young leaders to be activists, to release them. We do this in Frontier Youth Trust. We have a young leaders project where we trust young people. I think that's one of the things. We trust young people to do the job. We're constantly reminded, the disciples, we're probably all under 20. Mary, it's coming up to Christmas, Mary was trusted by God to bring Jesus into the world. And depending on which theologians you read, she could be anything from 12 to her late teens, but almost certainly not more than 20 years of age. And so there's a sense that if it was good enough for God, to trust teenagers to do this work, then I think it's good enough for us too. I wanted to draw attention to one particular project which I think models this wonderfully in England at the moment. It's called The Feast. It's based in the city of Birmingham in the centre of England. It basically works by bringing Christian young people and young people of other faiths together to explore faith, create friendships, and to seek to change lives. I think it's a profoundly influential project. It's modelling something which is very much rooted in the Christian story, but it's non-judgmental and it's non-accusing, and it's getting a lot of plaudits. And I offer it just as another way, another possibility of how we might go about addressing some of these justice issues which young people seem to be so passionate about. I'm conscious of the time, so I'm just going to move on. I think my third plea, and this is not meant to be an advert about the book, but here is the book cover. I think one of my endearing kind of things in the original book was I talked about rediscovering a bohemian and radical approach to Christianity. I think some people have done that, as I've mentioned, but I still think we could do some more. I didn't mean bohemian as in an immoral lifestyle, but I meant something which was dynamic, which was enterprising, risky-taking, was edgy, was perhaps a little anti-establishment and experimental. And I think this is another way where we can connect with the cultural drivers which are taking place. And I'll just read this quote from the book, which is, again, I'm not trying to promote it, I just thought this captured what I wanted to say. It says, current practice risks removing the passion, sense of adventure and transformative life experiences that come with engaging in political and social matters. This short-changes young people and creates a false impression about what being a disciple is. It's no wonder so many consequently give up on their faith in church because it's boring. If we do seek to convert young people and make disciples of them, then we need to help them convert their faith, relationships, finances, aspirations, politics, and how they live. Everything needs converting to be consistent with the principles of Shalom and the Nazareth Manifesto. Then, I believe, young people will genuinely live differently to the dominant culture around them. So my appeal here as we look to the future is if we can embrace a more dynamic, and I would argue perhaps traditional understanding of what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. The risk takers, the ones who sacrifice, who live life to the full in all possible ways in their pursuit of building the kingdom of God. So that would be I think that's my third appeal. However, there's something underpinning these three appeals which I'm making, and it's a discussion about power. I think one of the challenges, and perhaps this builds on what Stan was saying a few minutes ago for the post-Christendom youth worker and minister, is a recognition that the power is not ours. The power is God. But I think too often we risk approaching our youth work and ministry with a sense that we have the power. And I think I would like to rebalance that so that we don't assume it's ours, but we recognise that symbiotically young people have power too. I think this is difficult because at the moment in much of society, the media, politicians, adults, Christian leaders, they often marginalise young people in the way they talk about them and engage them and involve them in decision making and so forth. And I think the adults become the dominant group and they decide what's best for young people. And I think that's not a good way of engaging with this emerging culture and doing mission post-Christendom style. I think the sense that we come to the table, we come to the detached youth work, we come to the church meeting with a fresh view on power, to me, is very important. To me, it's a sense that if we're doing a Bible study, who has the power in that? Do we come with all the answers, just waiting for the young people to say something so we can give them the answer? Who is the custodian of those discussions? I think is an interesting question for me. And again, if we go back to Jesus, he seemed very content for the conversation to wander, and perhaps my encouragement might be to allow a similar process, and to not have to explain everything, to not have the last word, and to not bring the point of clarification, but to leave things hanging, leave things suspending, leave young people to reach conclusion. Similarly, in worship, who controls the worship? I remember shortly after the book came out, I did a training session for some ministers, and one of them uttered the immortal phrase, I allow young people to lead the worship once a year. And I immediately challenged the statement, and I said, who made you the curator of allowing who could do worship and how it was done? And all credit to the guy. He said, yes, you're right. I'm wrong on this. I shouldn't have that view. But all too often, adults, and particularly perhaps ordained or leaders, control what happens worship-wise, where I would hopefully we could have a more fresher kind of perspective, really. And in the same way, recognizing that leadership for me is a skill or a gift. It's not a position. It's not something to lord over someone else in a hierarchical way and have power over. It's an opportunity to equip and to serve others. And I think if we can rediscover what it means to be an effective leader that doesn't orchestrate everything they do around the power dynamic, then that would be a real welcome change in post-Christendom, I think. So before I kind of press on to the next bit, is there any more questions, Stan?
Yeah, here. We have a comment from Bobby. It says it involves, in what you're presenting, it says it involves a certain amount of vulnerability on the part of adults. If I pose a question about what it means to sacrifice or be sacrificed, I need to be willing to share my own stories and experience around that. In terms of that, where she's talking about vulnerability, because you have coached so many youth workers, what are some of the questions that you ask youth workers, congregations to ponder around Bobby's statement?
Okay. I think if I can just come at that slightly different way, I think the first thing I always say to youth workers is, hey, you're probably doing a good job. No one, they're not often told that, certainly in this country. They have sacrificed. They're often not well paid over here. They're often at the mercy of church congregations or their communities. And so my encouragement is to support the sacrifice they've made, to encourage them and tell them they're doing a good job. And I know it's slightly almost arrogant, but I often say, particularly when we're working with at-risk or challenging young people, the youth worker or minister is often their best hope. That, and it might take 40 years for that to be recognised, but as I'm getting a little older, I've lost count of the number of stories where someone will come and say, oh, do you remember me from 20 years ago, 30 years ago? And you reflect back and think, you were a nightmare. In love, of course, but now they attribute their success or turn their life around or whatever it is to the influence of that youth work project or that church or that worker in that season. So I think it's about understanding the long game and recognising that we literally might not see the fruits of our labour in that sacrificial way. But for me, the fruit does always come. It's just often hidden. So I think it is a very real question. I always like to be vulnerable. I nearly started tonight by apologising because I've had an horrendous 2 or 3 days. We've had some big issues we've had to deal with in front of Youth Trust, and we're all exhausted. But I didn't, because I thought, no, I can't be British. We need to be, positive. But if we can get vulnerability and be honest, and honest with the young people, I think that's a real powerful kind of place to be in. Say to the young people, hey, I've had a bad day, I'm having a bad time. I think rather than trying to be super Christian with all the answers, I think there's something in that narrative of vulnerability which is really important. With that place to answer.
It seems kind of going back to the your comments about social justice. In some ways, especially from church bodies that are, or if you want to say Christian bodies that are more evangelical, are there some struggles with that? With so much of the emphasis on almost like a Wesleyan or a pietist, in that focus of saving souls, that we lose sight of what connects really, and what are some of the best ways of connecting with youth and young adults by almost leaving out that aspect of what really makes where their passion is.
Yeah, I think if we had more time, this might be one of the additional key changes and transitions I've seen. It is certainly in this country, the mainstream evangelical church has really refocused a lot of its work around some social justice issues. We have food banks here where there's around about 1 million people now are accessing food banks because of the austerity program the government's introduced, and it's often been the evangelical churches that's been at the heart of those things. There's lots of people trafficking too, which again, it seems to be an issue young people connect with. They understand how that's a challenge, and again, many evangelical churches have been at the heart of some of those initiatives. So I think there has been a reordering. Yes, there's still debates and discussions and conflicts around some issues, particularly around perhaps sexuality and those sorts of things. But I think there has been a reordering and a refocus, which it's not just about the individual, but it is a wider world we live in, and how we use the planet and the resources we have. For me, it's very exciting, and it's part of the journey of rediscovery, really.
I'm going to, Nigel, I'm going to step away so you can continue with your presentation.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we're nearly there, folks. In Front of Youth Trust, we used this quotation from a book by Vincent Donovan, Christianity Rediscovered, this book here. It wasn't actually said by Vincent Donovan, it was said by one of his students in one of the prefaces to one of the later editions of the book. It says, in working with young people, do not call them back to where they were, and do not call them to where you are, as beautiful a place as that may seem to you. You must have the courage to go with them to a place that neither you nor they have been before. And I think as we kind of draw to a closing few comments, this would be my plea and my heart to take us forward into post-Christendom youth work and ministry, that we must have this courage to go with them to a place that neither of us have been before. And that might mean, going back to the sacrifice metaphor, we give up some of the things which we think are beautiful, and they are beautiful, I wouldn't wish to say they weren't, in the interests of new discoveries with young people. Richard Passmore is my good friend and colleague in Front of Youth Trust. He wrote this book last year. I did a little bit on it, and he's come up with this really exciting analogy, if you like. The book's called Here Be Dragons, and he got the title because in the maps of old, the map makers had limited knowledge as to where countries were. Many places were undiscovered, oceans were unexplored, lands were not impacted by people and so forth. And so when the map makers didn't know what was there, they simply put "Here be dragons" on the map. Now that all sounds a little bit scary, but that's not perhaps what I mean by it. What I would say by it, I hope we can go to the places where the dragons are on the map, the places of undiscovered possibility, the new lands where we can go together and do something together in a way which is really exciting and innovative and as yet not known. And I think that's one of the great things about being in this post-Christendom culture, is that we have an opportunity to go and do that in a really fresh and kind of dynamic way, which I particularly find really exciting. As we kind of come to the kind of close, really, this quote was in the original book. It's from one of your presidents, I believe. I've made it a more inclusive language, which I hope is okay. But it says, neither a wise person nor a brave person lies down on the tracks of history to wait for the train of the future to run them over. And I think this quote somehow brings something powerful to mind here, that whatever we think about this subject and wherever we're at and whatever we do, we can't just lie down on the tracks and hope it's going to be okay in the future. I think we have to respond, we have to be active, we have to go to where the dragons might be, and we have to trust God. We might have to be vulnerable and sacrifice within that. But for me, that's the exciting bit. If there is a selfish motivation within all of this for me, I think it's very about this exciting journey and possibility of where we might go. So my encouragement is not to be still and not to be passive, but to be looking for the dancing hand of God, to be looking for where God's Spirit is at work. And I think that's a wonderful opportunity. And perhaps a story for me just to illustrate that. I used to work in prisons a lot. We used to go to prisons and we used to do services, and we'd use art, music and drama and so forth. And the first time we used to take people with us, they would be petrified. Their faces would be white. They'd need to go to the toilet an awful lot before they went, and they were very nervous. But the thing they nearly always discovered was that God had got there before them. God was already at work in the prison. He was already at work in the lives of individuals, whether they recognized it or not. And I think there's a great sense that if we can grasp hold that this is not a passive God stuck in heaven, but this is Emmanuel, God with us, already at work in our community and in our young people. And somehow if we can connect with that and perhaps play a part in it, that's a fantastic privilege about how we can go forward. I don't know if you're there, Stan. I think there's just time for one last question which has come up. I find that valuable. Could you maybe just guide us?
Yeah, Gita has asked the question. She says, I understand the value of removing the mask when working with youth. I find that valuable she is active as a director in outdoor youth in outdoor ministry. Are there ways the congregations can be prepared for what it means to journey with youth once the walls are down?
Okay. Yeah, I think one of the things I have noticed is I come across many congregations who faithfully pray that God would send young people, and then he does send young people, but they're often not the young people which they were expecting, and so they might, shall we say, misbehave or express things in a different way to the norm. And what then happens to sort of truncate the illustration is the congregations then ultimately end up rejecting the young people. And I think this must fill God with despair. That he said, hey, I answered your prayer, but what happened? So I think there is some great preparatory work which needs to be done about some of the things we've talked about this evening, that if young people do come and we do engage and they do get involved, then don't expect it to stay like it is now. It will change, it should change, it has to change. And I think I would almost have the courage to say, if you're not prepared for that change, then please don't get involved, because I think it will just end up making it worse. The young people will be let down, the adults in the churches will feel hurt and disillusioned. So I think preparation is a really key, and I think it's one of the foundations, really. I was chatting to someone today who's just starting out on this journey and asked me for some coaching help. And she was obviously an elderly lady, retired, but she was still wanting to pioneer some youth work and some youth ministry. And I was delighted that she'd come wanting to prepare herself in this way. So I think we need to explain to congregations that if they are going to do the mutually beneficial symbiotic approach, they have to give, they have to work together, they have to go to a new place, they have to share lives. I think that's one of my frustrations of perhaps some of the churches I've been in is we share Sundays, but we don't really share our lives. And I think there's a need to share lives, which is sharing joys and pains, and hopes and disappointments. So I think all those things are very important in a way we prepare. So hopefully, as time is nearly gone, that's the answer to that question.
Is there are there some easy or not easy ways, but are there some best ways for congregations to begin to prepare that transition? What for youth workers, what might be some ways that builds momentum in a congregation that allows that transition to begin to take hold?
Yeah. I think language is very important. I think the language of church is not always understandable. I've been in and around church for decades, and I still come across phrases which I haven't got a clue what they mean. So I think language is very important. Assume nothing would be one of the mantras. They don't assume people know the ins and outs of Leviticus or whatever book of the Bible it is. Let's not assume people know the story. I often encourage people to, in terms of preparation, I often pose the question, if you were going to do youth work or set something up in a capital city like Baghdad, what would you and wouldn't you do? And I would argue that whilst the context is different, then what you would and wouldn't do things are often the same. We wouldn't make cultural assumptions. We would try to fit in with the indigenous culture. We would try to use language which was understandable, which was easy to access. Have artificial barriers which stop people participating, for example, in worship. We had a strange service on Sunday where people were standing up and sitting down so many times that no one knew whether they were coming or going, really. And those things, I think, something as simple as that I find alienating. So someone coming in, I think those things are very challenging, really. So just a few pointers there, I think, that are important. And some of the biblical stuff's not always kind of helpful. The lambs and Levites and Pharisees and all those. I think those things are really confusing. So I think if we can strip out some of that technical language and simplify it, I think that would be a step in the right direction.
Yeah. I'm going to ask Enton to come in and join us now to share some information about the continuing education units we make available and the information that our attendees need in order to access those forms. So hold on, Nigel. Stay where you're at.
Thanks, Dan. And I'll just invite those of you that are participating today to answer these two quick questions. How helpful was the presentation, the content, and the learning that Nigel was able to share with us? And then how well did you like this webinar format, the online meeting? In the meantime, those of you that are looking for continuing education units, I've posted that information now. Feel free to just go ahead and visit that link, and I'll post a live link into the chat window so that you can also click and go. But Stan, I'll turn it back to you and Nigel for any final things you wish to say. Thanks.
Well, Nigel, is in terms of as we think about youth ministry and the future, just kind of curious with the woman that called today, and I know it's context specific, but what do you do to engage people that come looking for help? What are some of the questions that you ask them in order for them to ponder and reflect on their setting, so that way they come to own that change, that transformation, that needs to take place, or can take place in a congregation or with a body of people?
Yeah, I think perhaps a few things. I would always try and glean a sense of what might God have said to the person or shown them or is currently doing, so that, as we mentioned already, join in with that, and kind of embrace that. Um, I, I often say to students when I'm perhaps marking some of their work, what sort of mark do you want? And in a similar way, I would say, what is it you're hoping to achieve? And so the lady today was very clear that while some people in the church wanted bottoms on seats, that wasn't her value base. And so I think those things are very helpful. And again, to me, it's about support and encouragement, and permission giving, some of the things that we've talked about, so that we do create that environment where the sense of it's okay to try and do this way. And I think finally the other thing is to not rush. Perhaps our consumer fast turnaround culture is kind of pushing us in a particular direction, but I think some of these things take time. It's okay to watch young people in a healthy way, to see how they do things, how they hang out, where they hang out, what they like, what they don't like, and to journey sort of in a medium to long-term way rather than looking for the quick fix. So those would be just, again, some of the things in an opening kind of gambit I would hope to engage and support someone in.
It's kind of going back to that the comment that you showed earlier about journeying with youth and not wanting to lead them to the beautiful place where we think they should go. There's a real emotional attachment, because if we are experienced in the church, oftentimes that vision that we have for the church is that of the church when we became most involved or really made a commitment to faith. And so that experience then really colors how we view church. What are some ways that you thought about or that you've worked with congregations or youth leaders in working through those emotional connections of the past, so that way we can be vulnerable, we can work with rather than trying to shape them or fix them in the way we want them to go?
I think sometimes it's appropriate that the worker might be journeying with young people in a new way to a new place, but they might need some sustenance in the way which they like as well. So if they can access that, I would encourage that, but I wouldn't want them to impose that in their new journey with young people. So there's something about how the work or the minister resources and sustains themselves, I think, is important. But I wouldn't want to, pander's perhaps the wrong word, but I think we do need to own up to the fact that if we are called to do this work, it's not actually about me. It is about the young people. And that might mean foregoing something. I'm excited by, some work done in the 70s and 80s, I guess, around faith development models. I think too many adults stop their faith development. It doesn't progress, it doesn't journey, it doesn't develop, it doesn't change. And I think I think we need to revisit some of those things. And I look at churches now, which when I was in my 20s would be my dream. And now I go, no, I don't want that anymore. Yeah. And I've gone over here. And so again, if we go back to some of the transitions that Stuart mentioned about being a sojourner or a traveller or a journey person, I think we can talk about these things, but I think we do have to acknowledge that this is a journey, and it won't come without cost, I don't think, would be one of the things that I would be gently trying to say, but with realism that it's a cost which someone somewhere have to pay, or we will, unfortunately, certainly in this country, probably preside over the decline and ultimately the extinction of Christianity as we know it, which would be a tragedy. So, I think it's a difficult question, and we need to get it out in the open and all those kind of things, and discuss those and find ways of making it work. And I think it will be difficult in contact.
Yeah. Well, I just want to pause now to thank everyone that joined today on the webinar, and appreciate your comments and thoughts, and just want to say that Nigel has invited you to connect with him by Facebook, and be in touch with him if you have any further questions, or just even to perhaps get some coaching from Nigel. He is be more than, I'm going to say, you'd be more than willing to do that. I just put you on the spot. So, but there's something that we can learn from each other. And so, Nigel, also just want to thank you for your presentation today. The depth of learning and wisdom and content that you shared with us that is so helpful as we think about ministry with youth and young adults, and even for ourselves as we grow older, that there's transition and change for us, and that image of a symbiosis is just so important today in the culture in which we live in.
Okay. Thank you, folks. Thank you for having me and for spending your time. I really enjoyed this opportunity, and I appreciate the invitation. So thank you. Thank you for all your technical support as well. We appreciate it.
Well, thank you, and we look forward to seeing you again. So.